You're standing in your kitchen right now and you've got a fridge, a freezer, maybe a pantry with canned goods. Take all of that away. No electricity, no ice, no preservatives with names you can't pronounce. Now imagine living in a jungle where it's 90 degrees with 80% humidity. How long does your food last? A day, maybe two, before everything rots. The Aztecs and Maya figured this out without any of our technology, and honestly, what they did was kind of genius. Here's the thing that blows my mind. These civilizations weren't just starving, they were running empires. The Aztec capital had over 200,000 people. That's more than modern-day Orlando, Florida. You can't feed that many people if your food goes bad in 3 days. So what did they do? They got creative, really creative, and some of their methods are still used today. Let's start with salt because salt is basically magic for food preservation. The Maya living on the coast weren't just collecting salt for themselves, they were running what was essentially a salt factory. Archaeologists found the ruins of these operations underwater off the coast of Belize. We're talking thousands of wooden posts that used to hold up entire buildings dedicated to making salt. They called them salt kitchens, and that's exactly what they were. Picture a thatched roof structure built over shallow water. Inside, workers are boiling ocean water in these special clay pots designed specifically for salt making. The pots were called briquetage, and they were kind of rough and thick because they had to sit directly in the fire. You boil the water, it evaporates, and what's left is pure salt that forms these hard cakes inside the pot. You break the pot to get the salt out, then stack these salt blocks like Legos. The salt cake could sit in storage pretty much forever if you kept it dry. But here's where it gets interesting. They weren't just making salt to season their food, they were using it to preserve fish on an industrial scale. The stone tools found at these sites show specific wear patterns. When archaeologists analyzed them, the marks matched exactly what you'd see if someone was scraping and processing fish day after day. The Maya would catch fish from the coastal lagoons, pack them in salt, dry them in the sun, and boom, you've got protein that lasts for months. Then they'd load everything into canoes and paddle it inland to cities that were nowhere near the ocean. Think about what that means. You're a Maya city dweller living 100 miles from the coast. Without this salt and fish operation, you'd have almost no way to get seafood, and your diet would be missing sodium, which your body actually needs to survive. The coastal Maya basically created a supply chain that kept interior cities fed. This wasn't a small operation either. The archaeological evidence suggests this was a major industry with different households competing to produce more. The Aztecs also used salt, but they had a different source. Lake Texcoco, where they built their capital, would dry up around the edges during certain times of year. When the water evaporated, it left behind this crusty white mineral deposit called tequesquite. Now, tequesquite isn't quite the same as ocean salt. It's more alkaline, kind of soapy if you tried to eat it straight. But in cooking, it's actually incredible. It makes beans softer, helps bread dough rise, and adds a unique flavor. You can still buy tequesquite in Mexican grocery stores today. Same stuff, used the same way for over 500 years. Okay, preservation method number 2. And this one's probably the oldest trick in the book. Drying. You remove water from food and suddenly bacteria can't grow. It's basic biology. No moisture equals no decay. The Aztec and Maya were drying everything. Meat, fish, vegetables, you name it. Well, let's talk about chilies because this is where it gets cool. You know what chipotle is, right? It's that smoky pepper you get in a burrito bowl. That's a smoked jalapeno. The word chipotle comes from the Aztec language, nahuatl. It's chipotle, which literally means smoked chili. This wasn't something they learned from Europeans. They were smoking peppers before Columbus was even born. The process is simple but effective. You take fresh jalapenos, put them in a smoking chamber, and let smoke and low heat dry them out over several days. The smoke removes moisture and deposits these compounds on the pepper's surface that kill bacteria. The dried chipotle can sit in your pantry for a year easy. The Aztecs had multiple words in their language for different types of smoked and dried peppers. That tells you this was a major part of their food system. They'd hang strings of dried chilies in their homes. Whenever they needed to make a sauce, they'd grab a few, rehydrate them, and grind them up. The Petlacalco market in the Aztec capital sold dried chilies by the basket. We know this because Spanish conquistadors wrote about it right after they arrived. They were amazed at the market's size. We're talking 60,000 people shopping there on a big market day. That's bigger than a sold-out NFL stadium. And the variety of dried goods available was insane. Dried fish from the coast, dried chilies, dried corn, dried beans, all of it preserved so it could travel without spoiling. Now here's where things get wild. Fermentation. You're probably thinking of kombucha or kimchi, right? Trendy fermented foods that cost $8 at Whole Foods. The Maya were doing this thousands of years ago, and they were doing it for survival, not Instagram. They had this drink called pozol. You made it by taking corn, cooking it with lime or ash to make it easier to digest, grinding it into dough, and then just leaving it out for a day or two. That sounds disgusting, right? Leaving food out in the heat? But here's what happens. Good bacteria, specifically lactobacillus, same stuff in yogurt, takes over the dough. These bacteria eat the sugars and produce lactic acid. The acid drops the pH and creates an environment where bad bacteria that would make you sick can't survive. Studies have actually analyzed pozol to see what's happening at a microbial level. It's a deliberate fermentation process that makes the food safer and gives it a sour, refreshing taste. Maya traders would form this fermented dough into balls, wrap them up, and carry them through the rainforest. When they wanted to eat, they'd just crumble the dough ball into water, mix it up, and drink it. Instant calories, instant hydration, and because of the fermentation, it wouldn't make them sick after days in the jungle heat. That's legitimately smart food science. They didn't understand bacteria the way we do now, but they understood through experience that this preparation method kept food safe. That knowledge was probably passed down through generations. Your grandmother teaches you to make pozol this specific way, and you teach your kids, and nobody dies from food poisoning because the method works. The Aztecs were also fermenting stuff. They made pulque from maguey sap. Pulque is mildly alcoholic, kind of sour, and it was everywhere in Aztec society. Religious ceremonies, daily drinking, you name it. It doesn't keep as long as pozol because the fermentation's more active, but it shows they understood how to control fermentation for different purposes. Let's talk about nixtamalization, because this process might have saved millions of lives over the centuries, and most people have never heard of it. Here's the setup. Corn is an amazing crop. It grows in all kinds of conditions, produces tons of calories per acre, and stores well when dried. But raw corn has a problem. The niacin, which is a B vitamin your body needs, is bound up in a form you can't digest. If you eat only corn without processing it right, you'll eventually get pellagra. Pellagra causes skin lesions, diarrhea, dementia, and if you don't fix it, death. The Aztecs and Maya figured out that if you cook corn in alkaline water, basically water with lime or wood ash mixed in, something changes. The hull loosens and the niacin becomes bioavailable. Your body can actually use it. Modern research has confirmed this and found something else. Nixtamalization also reduces certain mycotoxins, which are toxic compounds that mold produces on stored grain. Aflatoxin and fumonisin levels drop when you nixtamalize contaminated corn. So let's put this in context. You're storing dried corn for 6 months until the next harvest. Some of that corn might develop mold in storage. If you ate it straight, you'd be consuming mycotoxins that could damage your liver and cause cancer over time. But nixtamalization reduces those toxins significantly. It's not perfect, but it's way better than nothing. This process also boosts calcium because the lime dissolves into the corn. Every corn tortilla you've ever eaten was made with nixtamalized corn. Every tamale, every bowl of pozol, all of it starts with this process. The Aztecs and Maya didn't know about vitamins or mycotoxins, but they know empirically that corn prepared this way kept people healthy. That's incredible observational science over generations. Storage containers and architecture were just as important as the food processing. You can salt and dry food perfectly, but if you store it in a damp, pest-infested space, it'll still spoil. The Aztecs built these granaries called quetzalcoatl. Imagine a large wicker basket, maybe 6 feet across, raised up on legs to keep it off the ground. That's your corn storage. The raised design keeps moisture from seeping up from the soil, and the woven sides allow air circulation so condensation doesn't build up inside. The Codex Mendoza, which is this pictorial record of Aztec tribute payments, show these bins overflowing with corn, beans, amaranth, and chia seeds. The Aztec government required cities and provinces to deliver specific amounts of staple foods as tribute. Those foods had to store well enough to last until they were redistributed to the army or used in religious ceremonies or whatever the state needed. The entire system depended on dry storage working reliably. Individual families had smaller versions of these bins for their own use. The state maintained massive warehouses. There was this place in Tenochtitlan called Petlacalco that was essentially a strategic food reserve. When harvests were bad in one area, the government could redistribute from storage to prevent famine. The Maya had a completely different solution because their environment was different. The Yucatan Peninsula is basically a giant limestone shelf. Rainwater carves caves and caverns through the rock. The Maya took advantage of this by digging bottle-shaped chambers straight down into the bedrock. These are called Chultuns. Most were cisterns for catching rainwater, which makes sense because the Yucatan has no rivers on the surface. But some Chultuns were used for food storage. In the 1960s, an archaeologist named Dennis Poulston actually ran experiments. He dug reconstructed Chultuns to store different foods in them to see what would keep. Most stuff didn't do great, but breadnut seeds, which come from a tree called ramón, stayed completely edible for over a year underground. The cool, stable temperature and the protection from pests made a huge difference. In a hot, humid jungle, having access to underground storage that naturally stays cool is a massive advantage. Modern analysis shows Chultuns served multiple purposes throughout their use life. Start as a water storage, maybe transition to food storage, eventually become a trash pit when the site gets abandoned. But those experiments showed breadnut preservation are still significant for understanding how the Maya managed food security in an unpredictable environment. For everyday containers, people use dried gourds and ceramic pots. Gourds are nature's Tupperware. A hard-shelled gourd, once it's dried out, is waterproof, lightweight, and if you seal it with a stopper, it's basically airtight. The Maya and Aztecs made ceramic pots that were literally shaped like gourds because gourds worked so well as containers. Museums have collections of these tecomate-shaped vessels. Some are actually preserved gourds, others are clay versions of the same shape. A good sealed jar stored in a cool, dark corner of your house can keep dried seeds, salt, or ground chili powder fresh for months. Key is keeping out moisture and pests. Archaeological sites across Mesoamerica show these containers were everywhere. This was standard household equipment. Let's talk about travel food because this is where all the preservation techniques come together. You're a Maya trader walking from the highlands to the coast. That's maybe a week of travel through jungle. No gas stations, no convenience stores, no coolers. What do you pack? First, pinole. That's toasted corn ground into a fine powder. You can eat it dry, which gives you instant energy, or you can mix it with water to make a drink. Either way, it's pure carbs in a shelf-stable form. Dry pinole keeps basically forever. As long as it doesn't get wet, it's good. The Nahuatl Dictionary describes it as a staple food for travelers specifically because of how portable it was. Second, pozol balls. We already covered pozol. Form the fermented dough into balls, wrap them up, toss them in your pack, add water when you're hungry. Third, soali. This is popped or toasted amaranth seeds mixed with honey or maguey syrup and pressed into bars. If you've seen those Alegria candies in Mexican stores, the pink bars with the seeds, that's the modern version of soali. Amaranth is high in protein and fat. Honey is a natural preservative because of its low moisture content and antimicrobial properties. Combine them and you've got an energy bar that can survive weeks in a hot climate without refrigeration. Notice a pattern? Everything's either dry or acidic or high in sugar. These are all hostile environments for bacteria. The Aztecs and Maya engineered their travel food to survive conditions that would ruin a modern sandwich in hours. Here's something that doesn't get talked about enough. The way Aztec society was organized actually reduced the need for some types of preservation. The chinampas, which were these raised garden beds built in the shallow lakes around Tenochtitlan, produced fresh vegetables basically year-round. A farmer could harvest lettuce or flowers or tomatoes in the morning, load them into a canoe, and paddle directly to market. The produce would be on sale by noon, maybe 6 hours after harvest. Compare that to how food moves in modern America. Your lettuce was harvested in California, trucked across the country, sat in a distribution center, then sat in a grocery store, and finally made it to your fridge. That's days or weeks of transit time, which is why we need aggressive refrigeration and preservatives. The Aztecs had a zero-step supply chain for fresh produce. Harvest, canoe, market, done. The Tlatelolco market moved an insane volume of food daily. Fresh fish from the lakes, live turkeys and ducks, fresh vegetables from Chinampas, and they also preserved goods like salted fish from the coast and dried chilies. It was this mix of fresh and preserved operating at a scale that fed hundreds of thousands of people. The system worked because perishable items moved fast and preserved items could wait. Chinampas deserve more explanation. These weren't just fields, they were an engineered ecosystem. Workers would pile up mud from the lake bottom to create rectangular raised beds, plant trees around the edges for stability, dig canals between the beds for irrigation and transport. The result was incredibly fertile farmland that never dried out because it was literally built in a lake. You could plant multiple crops per year. One chinampa might grow corn, then immediately after harvest grow beans, then squash, cycling through constantly because the moisture and nutrients were always available. FAO, which is the Food and Agriculture Organization of the UN, has documented modern chinampas around Mexico City. Under proper management, they're some of the most productive farmland on Earth. Multiple harvests per year, minimal need for external inputs, and everything's close to the urban market. That's why the Aztecs could feed a city of 200,000 people without industrial agriculture. The system was designed for efficiency. For specific foods, let's break down the preservation methods. Chilies we've covered thoroughly, dried and smoked. Corn and beans stayed in granary bins, protected from moisture and pests. Sometimes those bins were in lofts above the cooking fire. The rising smoke would keep insects away. That's passive pest control that costs nothing. Amaranth and chia were both collected as tribute and stored dry. Both are seeds with high oil content, so they're calorie dense and they keep well if protected from moisture. Their use in Soali turned them into portable energy bars that travelers and soldiers relied on. Fish was either salted and dried for long-distance trade, or it moved fresh through the canal system if it was caught locally. The basin of Mexico had 5 interconnected lakes full of fish and waterfowl. There was a whole specialized economy of fishermen and bird hunters who supplied the urban markets daily. Even insects got preserved. Chapulines, which are grasshoppers, were toasted on a griddle, salted and eaten as a snack. That might sound weird to American ears, but nutritionally, they're great. High protein, low moisture after toasting, and the salt preserves them. 16th century records list grasshoppers among the foods sold in Aztec markets. The preparation method, dry heat plus salt, is itself the preservation. Cocoa beans are interesting because they serve dual purposes. After harvest, the beans were fermented inside the pods to develop flavor, then sun-dried. Once dried, cocoa beans could store for months or even years without going bad. But they were also valuable enough to use as currency. The Codex Mendoza shows cocoa listed as tribute payment. For something to work as money, it had to be durable and portable. Cocoa was both. You could literally pay for goods at the market with cocoa beans, and the person receiving them could either use them to make chocolate or just store them as wealth. The Maya of Yucatan kept stingless bees, which is fascinating because beekeeping is not easy. Stingless bees, specifically melipona bichayi, are native to the area and produce honey and wax. Archaeologists have found ceramic hive lids and other equipment that shows this was a developed industry centuries before Europeans arrived. Honey's a natural preservative. Low water content, acidic pH, antimicrobial enzymes, it basically never spoils. There's honey from ancient Egyptian tombs that's still theoretically edible after thousands of years. In Mesoamerica, honey bound the amaranth in soali bars, sweetened drinks, and showed up in religious ceremonies. The preservative properties were probably understood empirically. You leave honey in a jar and it never goes bad. It's pretty obvious even without understanding the chemistry. Here's what they didn't do, and it's worth mentioning to avoid misconceptions. Freeze drying is an Andean technique from Peru and Bolivia. At high altitude, you can take advantage of freezing nights and intense sun during the day to freeze dry potatoes into something called chuno. Central Mexico doesn't get cold enough consistently to do that. The technique just doesn't work in that environment. Vinegar pickling, like you see in European cuisines, requires wine vinegar or strong fruit vinegars. There's no solid evidence for widespread vinegar pickling in pre-Hispanic Mesoamerica. They had fermented drinks, but preserved pickles and vinegar are likely a post-contact development. Everything worked because of the science, even though they didn't understand it in modern terms. Drying lowers water activity below the level bacteria need to grow. Smoke deposits compounds like phenols that kill microbes. Salt binds water molecules so they're unavailable for bacterial growth. Fermentation creates an acidic environment and establishes beneficial bacteria that crowd out pathogens. Nixtamalization changes the chemistry of corn to reduce toxins and unlock nutrients. Underground storage in Chultuns provides stable, cool temperatures in a hot climate. Good containers and structures keep humidity and pests out. A sealed jar in a smoke-darkened loft maintains stable conditions. The whole system, chinampas creating fresh produce daily, markets moving food fast, tribute storehouses banking dried staples for lean times, reduce the time food spent at risk of spoilage. What's remarkable is how it all interconnected. Coastal Maya made salt and preserved fish. That product traveled inland through canoe networks, arrived at markets where chinampa farmers sold fresh vegetables. State collectors made sure dried corn reached warehouses. Travelers packed pozol and amaranth bars. It wasn't separate systems. It was one integrated food network designed to handle time. Fresh food moved immediately, stored food sat protected, and nothing went to waste. The Aztec and Maya never needed refrigeration because they engineered everything to work without it. Their agriculture produced continuously or banked dried goods. Their trade networks moved products before they could spoil. Their processing techniques removed water, added salt, created acidity, or sealed things underground. Their markets operated at a scale that kept fresh goods flowing daily. Think about it this way. We solve food preservation with technology. They solved it with systems. Salt from evaporated seawater, smoke from cooking fires, fermentation from naturally occurring bacteria, underground caverns carved from limestone, markets that moved 60,000 people's worth of goods in a day. Every piece supported every other piece. That's not just preservation, that's designing an entire civilization around the constraints of your environment. They didn't fight against the heat and humidity. They worked with it and built solutions that lasted for centuries. And some of them, like nixtamalization, salt curing, and chipotle peppers, we still use today because they work just as well now as they did back then.